We've made it to the month of May, so it's time to go through every film and TV show I watched in April. I started by rewatching School of Rock, which is an early 2000s film that is kind of dated and sometimes cringeworthy because of that. Jack Black gives a fantastic performance as expected, and the plot of the film is simple but funny. Coming back to the cringeworthy topic, I think that the score in this film is just so outdated, and when you hear it, you easily recognize what decade it came out in. The child acting is very meh in this film, and sometimes this film actually kind of dragged. It's not necessarily boring, but sometimes it just felt kind of long. In summary, School of Rock is a good, but not great film, and I hate to say it, but I actually like the TV show a bit better. Next, I watched Stand By Me. I just absolutely love coming-of-age comedies starring kids my age, so of course I really liked this film. The acting is great, and my favorite performance was given by Corey Feldman, who has acted in great films such as this and The Fox and the Hound. The whole concept of this film is hilarious, and there were some moments in this film where I laughed really hard. It was also sometimes surprisingly exciting at times, especially the train sequence where Gordy and Vern barely made it off the railroad track before getting run over. I think this is just another classic 80s comedy a lot of people should check out if they're into this type of film. After watching the Space Jam: A New Legacy trailer, I decided to watch the original Space Jam. The original Space Jam is absolutely horrible. The CGI is incredibly bad, and it has some of the most 90s cheese in a film that I have ever seen. But I love it. The acting is okay from Michael Jordan, but Danny DeVito and Bill Murray are fantastic. Space Jam is a really stupid movie, and some of the visuals are honestly disgusting. But it is just such a fun movie, and I can't help myself from enjoying it. The Looney Tunes are as fun and funny as ever, and the introduction of Lolo Bunny was done pretty well. This is the ultimate guilty pleasure of mine, even though I can still admit that it is a pretty bad movie. But despite its obvious flaws, this film gets a 9 out of 10 in my opinion. But objectively, this film would get like a 4 out of 10. It just makes me feel good after watching it, and I absolutely love the film. Then I watched The Princess Bride, a pretty cheesy and dated movie, but it is just so funny and has some pretty excited scenes, to be honest. It felt kind of long sometimes, even though it is actually not a very long movie. There are some really quotable lines, and there are also a lot of great and likable characters that have great performances from some great actors. The Princess Bride is just such a cheesy 80s comedy/adventure film, and is pretty good in my opinion. Then I binged a bunch of Spielberg films for my top 10 Spielberg films video, including Saving Private Ryan, Close Encounters of the Third Kind, Minority Report, Hook, and my favorite film of all time, Jurassic Park. During my Spielberg marathon, I watched My Dog Skip. The film is terrible. I hate to hate on kid acting, but the acting from the children in this film is so cringy. All the events that take place in this film also feel really forced. Like, I don't like this movie at all. I wish I could say otherwise, but I can't. This movie gets a 3 out of 10. Moving on. Next, I watched 2001: A Space Odyssey. Not much actually happened in the film, but honestly, I didn't mind that very much. I can praise the visuals to death, and most of the time it visually looks like a film made today. The best part of the entire film was the visuals, and I can't believe the film was made in the 60s. It was also just made amazingly. The soundtrack is great, and Stanley Kubrick's directing skills are amazing. Just the entire direction of the film was great, but if it didn't look fantastic, I wouldn't like it nearly as much as I do. Hal is a really intimidating villain/robot, and the thing that made him so scary was because his voice was so calm and low. He wasn't yelling, he just talked normally, but for some reason he was kind of creepy. I was a little bored by the film, but it's not as boring as people say it is. I still had to watch it in 2 days though, because it felt pretty long and pretentious. It had some pretty decent human characters, a good plot about Hal, but a bad plot about the monkeys at the beginning. 2001 A Space Odyssey has no comparison to other sci-fi films like Star Wars and Planet of the Apes on an enjoyment level, and it isn't a masterpiece. However, I will give it a 7.5 out of 10. The next day, I watched Superintelligence. I don't know why I watched this, but for some reason, I like these types of films. Superintelligence is not good. In fact, it is pretty bad, but it is entertaining, and honestly, that is all that matters with this type of film. Melissa McCarthy is pretty funny in this, and this is a pretty funny movie, but some of the plot points just didn't work really well with the film. After that, I watched Whiplash, and it was a masterpiece. The acting performances were some of the best ever, with characters that were intriguing, and that makes for an amazing movie. Then I watched Citizen Kane. Yes, the same rating I gave to Superintelligence. Sorry, not sorry. Okay, Citizen Kane is good, but kind of overrated. It is incredibly slow-moving and boring, and I get that it has very few flaws in the filmmaking, but it's just not for me. It's one of the most boring films I've ever seen, and after like 30 minutes, I was thinking, Citizen Kane, this film just end already. Orson Welles directed it at age 25, so that's pretty impressive. It has some great acting. It's a revolutionary film. I just couldn't connect with it, and I just didn't want to continue to watch it. But since the only flaw I have with it is how boring it is, I will just give it a 6 out of 10. I just wish it held my attention more. That is the only thing holding it back. Next, I watched Castaway, and it was honestly a pretty surprising movie. I thought it would be good, but I didn't think it would be this good. It's a very smart film that uses what it has to the best of its ability. This is a pretty generic thing to say, but while talking about this film, I can't not say that Tom Hanks' performance was fantastic, because it was. Wilson is funny, and this film is pretty unrealistic, but that doesn't really matter because this is just a fun movie. The script is pretty great, and the screenplay was written very well. This is just another Robert Zemeckis film that I love, and that just makes him one of my favorite directors even more. The first 15 minutes or so of the film wasn't the greatest, but the rest of the film made up for it because it was really good. The whole time I just wanted to see the main character Chuck succeed, and whenever he did by making a shelter or a fire, you felt satisfied and happy for him. I don't know how, but thankfully this film wasn't even boring once he got to the island. You'd think that a film about a guy stuck on an island for 4 years would be boring, but it's not. I was even really sad when Chuck lost Wilson, and honestly, I was getting really emotional, and that is partly due to Tom Hanks' amazing performance. What film can make you care for a volleyball? This film can. Castaway is a really great movie that makes me like Robert Zemeckis as a director even more, and Tom Hanks as an actor even more. Next was Rope. This was good. I really liked the characters, and the way Alfred Hitchcock developed the plot was brilliant. Alfred Hitchcock is one of the greatest directors of all time, period. The one-shot format doesn't really look like one-shot because you can clearly see when there was a cut, but that doesn't really matter because it is just supposed to feel like everything in the film is just continuously happening with no time jumps. We're just there with the characters the entire time. James Stewart is phenomenal in this and everything he is in, and he once again gave a great performance in another Alfred Hitchcock film. One subtle detail I really liked at the end of the film was that when James Stewart's character comes back to see if anything looks fishy, there are green and red lights shining on him from outside the window. It made the suspense a bit more suspenseful for some reason, and I really liked that. I just didn't think that this film was really entertaining. It wasn't at all boring, but it just never really felt as enjoyable as other Alfred Hitchcock films. But I still did really like this film. And then I felt like watching Yes Day. Like I said when talking about Superintelligence, I just love these types of films. Netflix seems to make some pretty good, but cliched, family comedies that I think are pretty good, and this film is no different. Maybe it's not a really well-made film, but it is just really enjoyable and funny. Jennifer Garner is a really funny actress, and I laughed multiple times while watching this film. This film has a lot of laugh-out-loud moments, and it was funnier than I thought it was going to be. I thought it would be a little funny, but kind of cringy, but the film was actually hilarious. The beginning of the film was actually really good, but once they went to the amusement park, it lost my interest a little bit. But everything before that I actually really liked. The rest was still good, just not as good. Also, the concept of a yes day is actually a really smart idea for a film, and made for a good plot and a good movie. On the 17th, I revisited Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. The fact that this was made in the 1930s is absolutely mind-blowing. The animation is just really, really good for when it came out, and I just cannot believe this film is so old. It is barely dated, and it is just a classic film I think everyone should watch. I can see why someone wouldn't like this film, but I do, because it was one of the first films that made film what it is today, and it has some really great plot points and characters. Snow White's singing was kind of obnoxious though, because it was super high and she sounded like a chipmunk for most of the time. The music itself was great, but the singing was just meh for me. For some reason, this film actually gets really dark and tackles some mature themes for a children's film, and that was a really brave move for a studio to make, but I think it worked well enough because the story to this film is kind of dark in general. Other than that, I think this film is great, and one of the best films Disney made early on. Go check this out if you haven't. Next is Guardians of the Galaxy. It's one of the greatest Marvel films out there. While the best thing about it is the comedy and tone, I think that the film also gets pretty sad and emotional, especially when Peter's mother passes away, and when Groot dies while protecting his friends. Obviously, the CGI is phenomenal, and only seeing one frame of the film can prove that. The film looks like it had a huge budget, which it did, and I think that every cent paid while making this film was worth it. I love the music played during the film, because every time they play a song from Peter Quill's mixtape, I sing along, if I know the song. Every character in this film is amazing, and for some reason, a film starring a talking raccoon and a talking tree works perfectly. Marvel took a risk with this film, and I'm glad they did, because I loved every second of it. The action sequences were great, and every scene in this film was enjoyable and entertaining. Also, this film is hilarious, and the acting performances from each and every cast member was great. There were some great side characters, such as Yondu and John C. Reilly's character. There were also a bunch of great one-liners thrown in throughout the film that made it even more funny. Guardians of the Galaxy is a mix of superheroes and Star Wars, and it is phenomenal. I just wish the sequel was as good. Spoiler alert, it's not. I was in the mood to watch one of my favorite films, so I decided to watch the original Jumanji. It has some pretty terrible CGI, but I really don't care. It's just a film that I have a really good time with, and it makes it into my top 20 of all time. Then I watched one of the funniest films ever made, Three Amigos. My boy Steve Martin has done it again. The film is hilarious, and I'm not just saying that. Whoever thought of Steve Martin, Chevy Chase, and Martin Short as the leads in a film are genius. The comedy in this film just lands perfectly, and I even laughed while watching the credits. El Diablo is a great villain, and the Three Amigos are really likable characters. This film is just super underrated, and a hilarious 80s comedy with a phenomenal cast. Also, did I mention the talking bush, the invisible swordsman, and the bartender? The talking bush was so funny and was voiced by Randy Newman. The invisible swordsman had one of the funniest moments in the entire film, and the bartender singing My Little Buttercup was priceless. My Little Buttercup. Then I watched one of the stupidest movies ever made, Pee-wee's Big Adventure. Everything in this film just didn't work and felt almost forced. Tim Burton's directing in this film is okay, but the thing that held it back was most of the acting. Even when the acting wasn't over the top, I think the acting just wasn't up to par. The acting from Paul Rubens is technically good since he's supposed to act childlike, but I don't know, it just did not work at all, and I hated how weird this film got. Tim Burton is known for being a weird and dark director, and I actually really like Beetlejuice, but Pee-wee's Big Adventure was a bad movie. It knows exactly what it is, it knows exactly what it wants to be, and it is exactly what it wants to be, but I just don't like what it wants to be. I honestly hated this. I guess if I were to say a positive thing about it, I would say that it could be a bit funny and quotable at times, and the score by Danny Elfman was pretty good, but overall, Pee-wee's Big Adventure was just way too weird for my taste. The only TV show I watched this month was Falcon and the Winter Soldier. I made an entire review of it. You can find that up in the right-hand corner, but I did not like it a lot and would give it about a 6 out of 10. Falcon and the Winter Soldier got me in an MCU mood, so I decided to rewatch the Man Duology. The first Ant-Man is actually a
crazy stupid fine
movie. It's one of the funniest films in the MCU, and to be completely honest, it might be even funnier than Guardians of the Galaxy. I kind of wish Edgar Wright did direct it. I've heard he has a fantastic sense of humor, and I think that if he directed Ant-Man, it would be the funniest film in the MCU. Paul Rudd gives a phenomenal performance, as well as Michael Douglas. Ant-Man is also one of the most rewatchable Marvel films. I've seen it 3 times now, and I have still laughed and had a good time. Ant-Man is Marvel's smallest hero, but he is still really powerful and beat the Falcon in a fight. Yellow Jacket is a very forgettable and weak villain, though he is better than the villain in Ant-Man and the Wasp. Michael Peña's character is hilarious, and every story he told throughout the film got a laugh out of me. The stakes in this film aren't very high, but it is still a good origin for the great superhero, Ant-Man. I don't think Ant-Man and the Wasp is as good as the first Ant-Man film, but it is still pretty good. It is a bit funnier than the first Ant-Man, but I just don't think the villain and plot are as good. The plot about the quantum realm was just kind of confusing, and a plot I wish they didn't choose. And the villains, plural, are forgettable and bland. Sonny is a character I think they should have completely removed out of the film, and the ghost villain was generic and had a bad backstory. The climax was fun, but at the same time pretty underwhelming too. But other than that, I think that this film is really good. It is one of the funniest Marvel films, and all of the protagonists are awesome. Ant-Man is still a great character, and Luis is absolutely hilarious. Michael Peña is so good as him, and every time he was on screen, it was funny. This movie also has some of the best visuals in the entire MCU. The quantum realm looks beautiful, and the way they enlarge the objects, such as the Hello Kitty Pez and a salt shaker, looks great. Agent Woo is an amazing character, and obviously he has the best character arc in all of Marvel, because in WandaVision he finally learned how to do the card trick Scott Lang did in this film. All of the acting from especially Paul Rudd, Michael Douglas, and Michelle Pfeiffer is great, and I love how this film ties into Infinity War, even while it is a much more lighthearted film and has less stakes. This film was just a fun break from the epic high-stakes films it followed up on, and a really funny MCU film, just not one of the best. I continued my comic book movie binge by watching the Man Trilogy. The first Iron Man was actually a lot better than I remembered it. I used to say that it was a boring superhero movie that I didn't connect with, but I don't think that now. I think it is actually the opposite. It's a really entertaining film, and I really enjoyed the plot this time around. Robert Downey Jr.'s charisma makes Tony Stark actually a really likable and funny character. Obadiah is a pretty weak villain, but he has some memorable lines, even though he isn't the greatest. The film got me caring for almost all the characters, and I actually got kind of sad when Ho Yin-sen died. The first act of the film, when Tony is trapped in Afghanistan, isn't as good as the second or third, but it still needed to be in the film to set up events that happen later in the movie. Iron Man is still my least favorite Iron Man movie, but it is still a solid beginning to one of my favorite franchises of all time, the MCU. I actually like Iron Man 2 better than the first Iron Man. I just think that Iron Man 2 is a great movie. People said that they needed more time to flesh out the story and the characters, and that they tried to set up the Avengers too noticeably. Well, you know what? I think the story was fine, the characters were great, and they set up the Avengers very well. This is usually the laughingstock of the MCU, but I really like it. Everything related to Tony's dad, Howard, was emotional and a nice touch to the film. Most of the comedy was actually pretty solid and got some chuckles out of me. I think there was just enough action in this film to keep me entertained, and especially the climax had some really great action. Whiplash was a good villain with a good motivation, though he is one of the more forgettable ones from the MCU. For most people, this is the MCU film everyone makes fun of for being bad, but to me, it is just a film with a lot of great things about it. Iron Man 3 was actually really good. It looks the best out of all the Iron Man movies, and it has the most and best action. The action is actually really unique compared to other Marvel films, and it was really awesome seeing a lot of the Iron Man suits all fighting at the same time. The scene where the Mandarin is attacking Tony's house is amazing, and the airplane scene is phenomenal. The action is just some of the best in the entire MCU, and I love the film for that. All of the characters, for the most part, are fine, though I do think that Happy Hogan was really underused because they put him in a hospital before the middle of the film. The Mandarin twist has never really bothered me, but I do think that neither Aldrich Killian or the actor Trevor that Ben Kingsley played were good villains. I don't think they're bad, but they were just forgettable and on the weaker side of MCU villains. I'm telling you, the MCU villains are not the best. Adding Harley to the film was a nice touch and brought some comedic but also emotional moments. Iron Man 3 also has the best and most funny Stan Lee cameo of all time. That cameo, man, is it hilarious. The film is definitely one of the more serious films in the MCU because it deals with terrorists. Tony Stark has anxiety, and some of it can be a bit more violent. It has a lot of funny moments, but it is more serious to me. The MCU is a really lighthearted franchise for film, but Iron Man 3 is more dark. That isn't a bad thing, however, because I think that it actually works well with this film and what this film is about. This is the best Iron Man movie and a film that actually really surprised me with how good it was. It's also one of the best non-Christmas Christmas movies. And then I watched The Sandlot. Again. I just really like it. I ended April by watching the original Mortal Kombat. To be completely honest, this is a bad movie, but it was just so stupid and cheesy that I had a good time with it. It is a really laughable and entertaining movie, and that is what I wanted and expected. The special effects are actually some of the worst I have ever seen, but for some reason that adds to the enjoyment. The fight scenes were horribly choreographed, but they always played 90s rock music or 90s synthesizers while they were happening, so the whole time you could just laugh at them. None of the characters were actually good, and I already forgot what the main character's name was. Mortal Kombat is just an entertaining 90s blockbuster that kind of sucks, but is also really enjoyable. I hate the original Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtle movies. I hate Batman and Robin. But for some reason, I had a fun time with this one. Also, this film didn't even tell me why combat was spelled with a K. And that's what I watched this month. Shout out to Letterboxd who made this possible for me to remember every movie that I did watch, so go follow me on there, not sponsored. But anyways, stay tuned and subscribe to Cinema Ranks.